Well, good morning. It's good to be with you. Just add one notice. You may have seen it this morning anyway, because I forwarded it to you. Is from Chris Runhar. Is I was going to get the name wrong otherwise. From Pekan Baru, Sumatra Presbyterian Church. I probably pronounced that all wrong, but they send their greetings to you from there. And also, if you haven't got a problem with your ears, if you start hearing ringing, there's a fault on the fire alarm, and they fixed it, but it will keep on going off from time to time. But we don't hear very much in this room. Which actually does sort of fit in with what we're looking at this morning. It's an important thing to do, for any of us to do, is to make priorities. And it's a great skill in doing so. The government has to do it, companies have to do it, organisations, and we have to do that personally. Because we're limited. We have limited time, limited resources. And you may have seen these sort of charts. I won't go through it now because it's not a time management seminar. But you might have seen these, you sort of have a spectrum of importance from not very to very important, and not very to very urgent. And so you want to do you have to do the urgent important things, but actually the unurgent important things need to be done as well. But we get swamped by urgent things that don't matter that much. Google that, it's interesting. But we have limited time and resources, and the church has to make priorities too. How do we decide on those priorities? Well, the surprise we find when we come to Mark, especially the bit that Ben just read to us, is that Jesus had to make priorities. Now, surely if anyone didn't have to make priorities because they're unlimited in some way, that would be Jesus. But actually, in his earthly ministry, he was limited in location and time. So if Jesus had to make priorities, we need to make them. And his priorities shape ours too. And there's two areas of priority we see here. Priority in service and priority in preaching. And we'll see how they're related and related things that flow out from them. But first, priority in service in verses 29 to 34. So last week we looked at verses 16 to 28, and there were dramatic scenes in the synagogue, their equivalent of a church. And it would have caused a stir if it happened here this morning. And they show Jesus' authority. He shows authority over the spirits with his words. And what we'd seen earlier on, right back in chapter 1, verse 13, is that there's a battle between Jesus and the devil. And what Jesus is doing, he's confronting the devil in all these different ways. Even if you don't see the devil there, he's confronting him and undoing the devil's work. And so the story continues into verse 29, and it says, immediately. We see Mark keeps on saying, immediately. So some people like Mark because it's pacey. Other people don't like Mark because they wish he sort of paused and dwelt on things like Matthew and John does. But he goes, immediately, next thing. As he leaves the synagogue, immediately, he's at Simon and Andrew's house with John and James. And then there's another immediately. And we're introduced to Simon Peter's mother-in-law. They're introduced to her as she's introduced to Jesus. Now, mostly we know Peter, that he's one of the better-known characters. And we know him through these interactions he has with Jesus. But a couple of times we just get a glimpse of a bit more of what he was like in his life. So we know he has a wife and has a mother-in-law. And this mother-in-law here is ill with a fever. Jesus takes her by the hand and he raises her up and heals her. And it seems so easy to him to do that. So again we see Jesus' authority. So we've seen his authority as a teacher, over spirits, and now over sickness. And we'll see more as we go through Mark, more authority that Jesus has. Different aspects of his authority. Now this little account here, it has the sort of note, the ring of an eyewitness account about it. So Mark is associated with Peter, with Simon Peter. We're told by the earliest Christians that this is like Mark writing down the memoirs of Simon Peter. And there's three other disciples here with them. And so what we see is Jesus undoing the work of the devil in this battle. That his authority over the evil spirits is the obvious case, but also sickness is also his work. Part of being in a fallen world is where a world that's broken by sin is our illnesses, our bodies go wrong. It's not that sin leads to a specific illness, usually, some do, but that the underlying first cause, the first part of the problem, is sin, and this broken world by sin. And Jesus is eventually going to deal with that. We'll see that as we go through Mark as well. And so verses 32 to 34 is the end of the Sabbath day, and people are coming to Jesus, and people are healed, and the spirits are cast out. The devil's tyranny over them is lifted. And it's the way it's worded indicates that that is not uncommon for Jesus to do that it's not a few people. And so what a joyful evening that would have been. Satan is pushed back and people are freed. But he focuses on just one of them. It's made personal because it's personal to the writer. This eyewitness aspect of Peter's mother-in-law in verse 31. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. So notice how it happens. Jesus touches her and heals her, lifts her up. She's laid low, he lifts her up. And the result is she serves. Specifically, Jesus touches her and she serves them. So the result of being restored by Jesus is service. And the way to serve is to serve his people. Jesus has everything he needs, but we don't. So this is our first priority to see. We need to be served by Jesus before we serve. We need to be touched by him first. It's not a case as that we serve to be acceptable to Jesus. Rather, we're accepted by Jesus to serve. Now, often people want to help, but they're not so sure about Jesus. I've found this in every church I've been to, people who will do almost anything apart from come to church, or will want to be very involved. They're not so sure about the whole Jesus bit, which is kind of the main bit. It feels good to be involved. Another thing I've seen every church I've been a part of is people want to rope people into the work that church does, so they have to hang out with Christians and hear about Jesus. But before we serve Christ's body, we have to be part of his body. We really need to be touched by him first. I know there's all kinds of grey areas about how that happens, but the principle that we have to be touched by him and restored by him before we serve them. But also notice it is the result of meeting Jesus is service. It should be an outworking. Once we've been restored by him, we serve each other. The fact is, everyone, as you just walk down the street, you drive home, and you look at anyone on the street, everybody is serving. They're serving somebody. And ultimately, when you peel back that a couple of layers, they're serving the devil or Jesus. Now, I heard a survey a few years ago, so maybe 18 years ago, but I don't think it'd be that out of date. And there were hundreds of answers to this survey, and it was, what are you looking for in a church? When you move town, or you just get fed up with your church, what are you looking for in your next church? And out of all these hundreds of answers, they boiled down, most of them boiled down to this: that it meets my personal needs. That I look for my personal preferences. So, one example is we want a place to meet as we are now that works for what we do. We may have other preferences of what we want in that, but some people put that above the other considerations. Or do I enjoy this or that element of what happened in the service? Do the people, this has struck me when this happened a few times, do the people meet my needs? That frankly, you're the wrong kind of people for some people, and you're not just like me. Not the question, am I meeting theirs? Now, Jesus frees us, and he frees us to serve each other. And so when you think what this is now, and not just what we do on a Sunday morning and Sunday evening, not even midweeks, but just what church is a matrix of service. We're a group of people that have been pulled together by Jesus. We know each other a bit. And this is a matrix to serve and to be served by one another. And that means giving up our preferences, our rights, that what do I want for others and what do they need? And Jesus is going to show us more of that as we go through his gospel, Mark's gospel. So Jesus restores us, and restores us leads us to service. But service isn't showcasing. Now, some service is obvious. It's by necessity, it's in front of others. So Colin and Iris and James, they would have practiced this week, and whoever stands here has always practiced all week and helped each other to do that. And so we see their service, and it's considerable service. We could box them in, I guess, but that might not help the rest of us. There's other times when our service is by necessity in front of each other, but much service, maybe most service, is unseen and often unthanked. It's worth thanking people when they do things. I always forget to thank people. Worth thanking people when they do things, but when we serve, we don't expect to be thanked. There's only one person who sees everything we do. And so right now the situation we're in as a church is we move the church in and out every week. So be grateful, we've given you so many opportunities to serve. But also we know each other, don't we? We should be getting to know each other. And so as we speak to one another, we find small things to serve each other. And those small things often make a big difference. One of them you're doing right now, just being here. In some ways, as people have said before, God doesn't benefit from our attendance. We benefit from being here. But actually there is a significant thing, a significant service in presence. But the fact that you are here has encouraged someone next to you. It certainly encourages me when I look out at you. It's a significant thing that you are here. Don't underestimate the impact your presence has on another. And so the first priority in service is that we need to be restored by Jesus, then we serve. But it needs to be that way round. But Jesus restores us for service. The other thing is priority in preaching in verses 32 to 39. I know I'm overlapping it, but we just touched on 32 to 34, and it paints this beautiful picture, doesn't it? Just a few words, a picture of great joy. All sorts of people coming to Jesus, and they're healed and they're freed from the devil. And I guess being freed from the devil would be a very broad thing, wouldn't it? And in Jesus, people are finding freedom. And they're significant numbers. And it seems to be not a one-off event. Now, wouldn't you want to have been there that night, that Sabbath, after the events in the synagogue, go along, see a bit more, and watch all this happening? I totally want to be there. If you could have a time machine, this would perhaps be one of the moments I'd go back to. That is our dream, isn't it? Seeing significant numbers coming to Jesus and being freed. And so verses 35 to 39 come as a surprise to us. In fact, a couple of surprises, I think. Verse 35. And rising early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. Now, to state the obvious, in case we lose it, is where I'm going to go next, Jesus prayed. And he prayed alone. Jesus needed to pray, and if he needed to, we need to. When you don't pray, and you can't pray 24/7, you've got a job to do and other things, but we set aside time to pray, and there's times we don't. We all miss those times. But when I analyse what I'm doing when I don't do that, two wrong sort of sequence of negatives there, but you know what I mean. What am I saying? I'm saying I can cope alone. I'm saying that I can cope better than Jesus can, which is nonsense when you put it that way. But it's very striking that it's mentioned here. Because in Matthew, Luke and John, as you read through the Gospels, we're accustomed to seeing Jesus praying. He's praying all the time. But in Mark, we're told Jesus prayed just 3 times. And all of those, this is the first one, all of those are in a time of crisis. And I'm going to work backwards. So the last time he prays in Mark, towards the end, is in Gethsemane. Obvious crisis, where he says, not your will but mine, about going to the cross. The middle crisis is the disciples just don't get it. And he prays for their eyes to be open. And this is the first one. What's the crisis? Everything is going so well. Imagine the scene over the next couple of weeks. So next week, 100 new people visit CPC. And then the following week, they come back, and another 100 with them. And the elders declare we're in a crisis. Well, it would be a practical crisis. But the devil is being driven back. People are coming to Jesus and being freed. What is the crisis? Verse 36, Simon and co. search for Jesus. Verse 37, they then state, everyone is looking for you. Now, of course, Jesus prioritised the private prayer with his Father. They want him healing and delivering. And so we may be a little bit surprised that Jesus doesn't go where the demand is, but withdrew. But it kind of makes sense, and perhaps when we think about it, we're not that surprised that he needs this fellowship with his Father. But then comes verse 38. And he said to them, let us go to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is what I came for. Now notice two surprises, even shocks. First, let us go to the next towns, and two, that I may preach. Why? Well, verse 38, it's what I came for. Now, do you see the crisis now, or what he's praying about? Jesus understood, or Jesus is understandably popular. And so he's being sought out as a popular miracle worker. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way, all these shallow people just want miracles. Wouldn't you want this? Wouldn't you want to be touched by Jesus, to be healed, or to be freed from what binds you? The illness of a loved one gone, the oppression of the devil lifted. That is not entirely selfish, I think. But it shows a twin priority, to go to the next town and to preach. Let's think about that. Go to the next town, or towns, he says. Jesus has a ready-made crowd in Capernaum, and he's not finished the work there. People are still coming with their needs, and yet his priority is the next town. And you might think, that sounds callous. That's a bit hard-nosed. He doesn't want to go over the same ground. Paul, in his letters, shows a similar concern. He didn't want to plant churches where others were. He wants to go to new areas. Luke 15, Jesus said God is concerned about the one lost, not the 99 found. Now, it's counterintuitive because we see a lot of need and we want to go to the crowd where all the need is. But Jesus takes his disciples and says, let's go to a place where we don't know how they're going to respond. The journalist Tim Stanley said this: evangelism is a game Christians play amongst themselves. Evangelism is a game that Christians play amongst themselves. And when I heard that, or read that rather, it cut me because I think it's true, and it might even be true of me. So we need to consider in our prayers, in our plans, those who have no knowledge and, humanly speaking, no opportunity to know about Jesus. Now, of course, any given church needs to be served and to be kept going, else the ones that exist would die out. But for this purpose. Now, someone commented, if I've heard this comment a couple of times, that there are lots of churches in Chelmsford. And I think there's twice as many churches in Chelmsford as in the last town I lived in, which is of a similar size. And I thought, I reckon there's at least 20 churches. So I counted up and wish I hadn't started. There's about 70 churches in Chelmsford. With astonishment, I told Ben, and he said that's half of Columbia, which is slightly smaller. But I think there is still the equivalent job of going to the next towns, because I sometimes look for an illustration, then wish I hadn't, because then I'm sucked into the maths of the illustration. So if you divide the population of Chelmsford by, I've done the maths for you, you'll be pleased to know. If you divide the population of Chelmsford by 70 churches, and some of these churches are only the size of our home groups, we need an average attendance of 2,286. 2,286 for everyone to be going to church. I suggest the average church is smaller than that in Chelmsford. Churches together consider a large church to be one of 100 or more. We are considered average size. So we need to grow by 38 times to be considered pulling our weight. I know that might not be the way forward, but you get the point. That's before we consider our responsibilities to the villages that don't have churches, and before we consider the world. In France, there are whole counties with no Protestant church, not churches like I like. So we've got a long way to go. Nonetheless, we are more church. We are better off than some cities, perhaps. But the point here is there's plenty to do. To pastor the flock, to care for each other. But our priority isn't for the 99. So the fact that you are here means you are on the low priority list, because it's the one out there that Jesus' heart and his priority is for. And actually part of the point of pastoral work and pastoring and serving each other is to ready and equip each other for that one that's not here. And so we need to be ready for what is unsafe and unpredictable, whatever our equivalent is of going to the next town. And notice Jesus said the next towns. So the job doesn't finish until he returns to the next town and the next town, or the next person, place, or whoever it is that needs reaching. And the job there is to preach. Now, by that I don't mean that is everyone's job. We're not all preachers. But consider what's happening here. Feel the surprise. I think it helps me when I'm reading the Bible, is to feel this. I kind of predict where it's going to go, because I know the Bible a bit. But sometimes it surprises us. So feel the surprise of what's happening here. As Jesus says, verse 38. Imagine, I sometimes do this, imagine the disciples' faces and the bits of the conversation that Mark hasn't included. So they come in and say, Jesus, at last we found you. What are you doing here? Look, people are queuing and it's getting awkward. And they're asking, look, the mother-in-law, thanks by the way for that, but the mother-in-law is stalling them. Some of them actually look pretty ill. Will you come back with us? And Jesus responds, let's go to the next town, because that's where I've got to preach. Not I'll come back with you to heal. There's an obvious need, but I'm going to go to a place. We don't know how they're going to respond. Jesus' priority is not healing or casting out spirits, but he came to go to the next town and the next town to preach. The priority for Jesus is preaching, not miracle working. Now the miracles show his power and his compassion. Jesus restores people, he undoes the works of the fall in them, the devil's oppression that affects our fallen bodies, but his compassion takes them to the root issue, and that is the sin that alienates us from God. Now how does he do that? Well, stay tuned, Mark will get to that. But part of that will require teaching to understand and know who Jesus is. Miracles deal with the symptoms, preaching goes to the heart. So Jesus is not being hard-nosed here. It seems so at first. I'm sure if I was one of those 4 disciples, I would have been shocked by his answer. There's a queue of sick and enslaved people, and Jesus says, no, I'm going to go off to give a sermon to a place where I've not been invited. But he knows that in eternity that's more significant. So the miracles show us Jesus' identity and his authority. They show his compassion to remove suffering and how he will ultimately undo the fall. But it's not a solution in eternity. To state an obvious thing, and I've probably said this before, because it's so obvious and missed, there is a 100% death rate amongst Christians. In fact, the death rate amongst Christians is slightly worse, because a few people we know had to do it twice, didn't they, in the Gospels. So we need the root issue of sin and knowledge of God to be dealt with, and for that Jesus preached. And so we've seen that it's kind of been hinted already that preaching is already a priority for Jesus in Mark. And Jesus states specifically, this is why I came. And it's striking, isn't it, that even Jesus had priorities. And his priorities shape ours. A church shouldn't just want growth. Growth is great and it's encouraging. It's also an indicator of something. Although there are so many multiple reasons behind growth, stagnation and decline, you never know quite what's behind it. And actually even growth can be in itself a cosy thing. That we go, it's great, it's fine, just keep everything the same. Let's just stay in this zone. But actually, Jesus' priority is to go to new ground, to new people, those who've not heard. And maybe we lose our comfort, our sense of any success we might have, might be lost. And the way to do that, he says, is to preach. Not a miracle. If he grants a miracle, I'm not going to complain. But not by miracle or some other way. We want to pray for people. We want to see in their life an easing of the experience of living in a fallen world. But our priority is to preach and tell them about Jesus. And we're equipped for that by coming under preaching ourselves. Preaching sometimes draws all sorts of people, non-Christians even, to come and hear about Jesus, to meet with him. But sometimes the same preacher, with doing the same sermons another time, repels people. But our priority is still that, preaching, because we're told to, because the results are seen in eternity, not over weeks and months or even years, and because it's Jesus we want to draw them to. And so we draw people to Jesus with Jesus. Jesus' own preaching had mixed results. People came to Jesus for a miracle. They came to Jesus for what they would get from Jesus. And people now come with mixed motives, and that's fine. But Jesus we offer in his word. And our task is to preach. Our corporate task as a church is to preach and leave the results to God. So there's various things a church can do, but at the heart we proclaim Jesus. What the Christian needs is preaching. What do we need to give to the world? Proclaim Jesus. What does the preacher need to do? Now this is an obvious thing. He needs to preach. And I say that because someone made an astute remark that we've gone from pastor preachers to manager therapists. This word shapes our life and our worship. Again, to state the obvious, it's like everything else in the Bible. Why are we told this? Why are we told this? Why are we told this here? It's because we're tempted to do otherwise. It's easy to take some shortcut, or to want a shortcut, or to find what draws people, to make a name for ourselves, to do something easier and less awkward. Jesus needed to make priorities than we need to, each of us and as a church. And it's a way to think about repentance. We looked at that word and that idea of repentance already in Mark. Another way of describing repentance is making my priorities what Jesus' priorities are. Changing my priorities to his priorities. So we need to do as Jesus did. We need to take ourselves out of busyness and distraction and pray, to refocus, not to follow the chatter and demands, but ask, what are we meant to be doing? That when we experience Jesus, it leads to service. At least it should do. And our priorities that it's that way round. That we prioritise the next towns, that we prioritise the one that's not here, not the 99 that are. We prioritise the lost, the one that hasn't heard, over our preferences and needs and the demands made of us. That's what service is. And we prioritise preaching. That is, speaking about Jesus. Speaking about Jesus to the lost. And offer Jesus over anything else they think that they need. And we need to be shaped by word-centred worship. So I'll close with just a question for you to ponder for the afternoon. Are you prioritising the things that Jesus prioritises? Let's pray.